The homeless boy found something no one expected. What he did with it shocked the whole city. Tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. Click the like button and let's begin. Daniel was 11 years old when he learned that January in Detroit could kill you just as easily as hunger or violence. He had been living on the streets for 8 months, ever since the last group home had kicked him out for fighting back against an older kid who was stealing food from the younger children. The social worker had looked at him with tired eyes and said there were no more beds available in the county. She'd given him the address of a temporary shelter and wished him luck. That was the last time Daniel had seen her. The city stretched around him like a frozen graveyard of broken promises. Abandoned buildings lined entire blocks. Boarded windows stared out like blind eyes. The auto plants that had once employed hundreds of thousands had closed decades ago, leaving behind shells of industrial dreams and neighborhoods that had slowly emptied out. Daniel knew Detroit in ways most people never would. He knew which soup kitchens served on which days. He knew which police officers would pretend not to see him sleeping in doorways, and which ones would chase him with genuine malice. He knew the dangerous blocks where gang recruiters waited for desperate kids like him, promising protection and purpose in exchange for things that would destroy what was left of his childhood. He had learned to navigate all of it with the careful precision of someone who understood that a single mistake could be fatal. But he had never faced a winter like this one. The cold came in waves that felt personal, like the city itself was trying to drive out anyone who didn't belong. The temperature dropped to -20 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind off the Detroit River cut through clothing like it wasn't even there. The shelters filled past capacity within hours. Daniel had tried 3 different locations on the same night, standing in lines with dozens of other desperate people, only to be turned away each time. "We're full," the volunteer at the last shelter had said, genuine sorrow in her voice. "We're already violating fire code." "I'm sorry, son. I really am." Daniel had nodded and walked back into the night, because what else could he do? That was when he made the decision that would change everything. Instead of trying to survive on the streets in temperatures that would kill him before morning, he would find shelter in one of the abandoned industrial buildings on the east side, places most people were too afraid to enter. The Packard automotive plant had once been one of the largest factories in the world. Now it was a sprawling ruin of broken concrete and twisted metal, 3.5 million square feet of decay spread across 40 acres. Most of it was too dangerous to enter, floors collapsing into basements, walls ready to topple at the slightest touch. But Daniel had explored sections of it during the warmer months, mapping out areas that were relatively stable, places where the roof still held and the walls blocked the wind. He approached the complex as the sun disappeared completely, moving through gaps in the chain-link fence that had been cut and recut by countless trespassers over the years. The interior was darker than the street, and colder somehow, as if the building itself was a reservoir of frozen time. Daniel's breath came out in clouds that disappeared into the blackness. He used a small flashlight he'd found in a dumpster, the kind that runs on a hand crank, and moved carefully through corridors filled with debris. He was heading toward a section he remembered, a corner room on the second floor where machines had once stood but were now gone, leaving a relatively clean space where he could lay down cardboard and try to stay warm under every piece of clothing he owned. But he never made it to that room. As he crossed what had once been a loading area, his foot went through rotted floorboards. Daniel dropped straight through, flashlight flying from his hand, his body falling into darkness. He hit the ground hard, the impact driving air from his lungs and sending pain shooting through his left shoulder. For several seconds he couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Panic flooded through him as he wondered if he'd broken something, if he was trapped, if this was how it would end. But slowly breath returned. Pain sharpened into something manageable. He moved his arms, his legs. Nothing was broken. He'd fallen maybe 8 feet into what appeared to be a basement or sublevel he hadn't known existed. The flashlight had landed a few feet away, still working. Daniel crawled toward it, his hands scraping against concrete and something else, something that felt like fabric. When he grabbed the flashlight and pointed it at what his hands had touched, His heart stopped. It was a tarp, industrial canvas, covering something large and rectangular. Daniel pulled the tarp aside, coughing as decades of dust filled his nose and throat. Beneath it was a leather suitcase, old and cracked but still intact, with brass fixtures that had turned green with age. It was locked with a combination mechanism that had rusted partially, but the leather itself had held up remarkably well, as if someone had treated it with preservatives before hiding it. Daniel stared at it for a long moment, his mind racing. Someone had hidden this deliberately. Someone had covered it with a tarp and left it in a basement that was now sealed off from the main building. Whatever was inside, it had been meant to stay hidden. His hands were shaking, and not just from the cold, as he tried to open the lock. The rusted mechanism resisted at first, but decades of corrosion had weakened it. After several minutes of working it back and forth, he felt something give. The lock opened with a soft click that echoed in the darkness. Daniel lifted the lid slowly, half expecting to find something terrible, drugs or weapons or worse. Instead he found envelopes. Dozens of them, maybe 50 or more, all made of thick paper that had yellowed with age. They were arranged in careful stacks, each one sealed with wax and addressed in elegant handwriting to different names and addresses throughout Detroit. Daniel picked up the first envelope carefully. The address was for a house on Brush Street, and the name was Josephine Williams. The return address simply said, J.M., Documentation Preservation, 1967. He opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a handwritten letter on formal stationery, a black and white photograph of a family standing in front of a 2-story brick house, and several official documents that Daniel had to read twice to understand. The letter was written in careful script. Dear Mrs. Williams, I am writing to you in the hope that someday you or your descendants will receive this documentation of what was taken from your family. On March 15, 1958, your family was forcibly removed from your home at 412 Brush Street under false pretenses of urban renewal. The documentation I have enclosed proves that the eviction was illegal, that your family held clear title to the property, and that city officials accepted bribes to facilitate the transfer of your land to private developers. I have been collecting evidence of these crimes for 9 years, but I no longer believe the system will hold anyone accountable. I am preserving this evidence in the hope that future generations will have the courage to demand justice. Your family was robbed. I'm sorry I could not stop it. James Morrison, City Housing Inspector. Daniel read the letter 3 times, then looked at the documents. They were property deeds, insurance policies, bank statements, and sworn affidavits, all carefully preserved in protective sleeves. He opened another envelope, then another. Each one told a similar story. Families evicted illegally. Property stolen through bureaucratic corruption. African American neighborhoods systematically destroyed under the cover of urban development programs. Evidence carefully documented by someone who had witnessed it all and had tried to preserve proof of what had been done. Daniel sat in the cold basement, surrounded by evidence of historical crimes, and slowly understood what he was holding. These weren't just old papers. These were proofs of inheritance. Documents that could restore property rights, claim insurance settlements, prove ownership of land that had been stolen decades ago. Each envelope represented a family whose history had been erased, whose wealth had been taken, whose future had been redirected by corruption. And now all of it was in his hands. Daniel's first thought was survival. These documents had to be worth something. Someone would pay to keep them hidden. Or maybe he could sell them to lawyers who specialized in historical property cases. Or maybe there were rewards for finding evidence of government corruption. For the first time in months, he saw a path out of homelessness, out of hunger, out of the constant fear that defined every day of his life. All he had to do was use this discovery for himself. He sat there in the darkness, holding envelopes that represented other people's stolen lives, and felt the weight of a choice he had never wanted to face. Outside, the temperature continued to drop. The wind howled through broken windows somewhere above. Daniel was 11 years old, alone, freezing, and holding the only valuable thing he had ever found in his life. And he had to decide what kind of person he was going to be. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He sat in the basement of the Packard plant, surrounded by evidence of other people's stolen inheritances, while his own body slowly froze. He had pulled the industrial tarp over himself for warmth, but it did almost nothing against the cold that seeped up from the concrete floor and down from the broken building above. His mind wouldn't stop racing. He kept picking up envelopes, reading the names, looking at the addresses. Some were streets he recognized, though most of the houses were probably gone now, demolished or burned or simply collapsed from decades of abandonment. But some of the addresses were in neighborhoods that had survived, places where families still lived, maybe even descendants of the people these envelopes were addressed to. One envelope caught his attention more than the others. It was addressed to Marcus and Ruth Henderson, 2847, West Grand Boulevard. The letter inside was dated April 1962, and it described how the Henderson family had been evicted from their home to make way for a development project that never materialized. The house had been worth $12,000 in 1962, a significant sum. But more importantly, the envelope contained documentation that the Hendersons had also owned a small commercial building on nearby Woodward Avenue, property that had been transferred illegally to a development company that still existed today. Daniel knew West Grand Boulevard. It was only about 3 miles from where he was sitting. And the letter mentioned that Ruth Henderson had a daughter named Gloria, who would have been 8 years old in 1962. If Gloria Henderson was still alive, she would be in her 60s now. And if these documents were legitimate, she might own property she didn't even know about. The thought formed slowly in Daniel's mind, fighting against the simpler instinct to protect himself first. But once it took shape, he couldn't shake it. What if he actually delivered these envelopes to the families they belonged to? It was a crazy idea. He was a homeless kid with no credibility, no adult to vouch for him, no way to prove he hadn't stolen these documents himself. Most people would probably slam the door in his face or call the police on him. But what if even one family believed him? What if even one person got back something that had been stolen from them? Daniel looked down at his hands, cracked and dirty from months of surviving on the streets. He thought about his own parents, who had died when a space heater caught fire in their apartment 3 years ago. They hadn't owned anything worth stealing. They'd rented everything, paycheck to paycheck, always one disaster away from homelessness. Which was exactly what had happened to Daniel when they died. The system had failed him completely. Foster care had been a nightmare of overcrowded homes and burned-out social workers. Group homes had been worse. And eventually he'd ended up on the streets, where at least the dangers were honest and visible instead of hidden behind institutional bureaucracy. But these families whose names were on the envelopes hadn't failed. They had been deliberately robbed. Their property had been stolen by people who were supposed to protect them. And someone named James Morrison had cared enough to document it all, even knowing that he probably couldn't stop it from happening. Daniel had no idea who James Morrison was or what had happened to him. But the man had preserved this evidence for a reason. He'd hidden it carefully, hoping someone would find it someday and do something with it. And now that someone was Daniel. As the first gray light of dawn filtered through the broken building above, Daniel made his decision. He would deliver the envelopes. Not all at once because that would be impossible. But one by one, he would find the addresses and knock on doors and give people proof of what had been taken from them. Maybe nothing would come of it. Maybe everyone he found would think he was lying or crazy. But at least he would know he'd tried to do something right with the only valuable thing he'd ever found. It was a decision that felt too big for an 11-year-old to make. But Daniel had stopped feeling like a regular kid a long time ago. He carefully packed the envelopes back into the leather suitcase, keeping out only the Henderson envelope and 2 others with addresses he thought he could reach on foot. Then he hid the suitcase under the tarp again and climbed out of the basement using debris piled against one wall. The sun was rising over Detroit, turning the frozen city into something almost beautiful, all ice and light and architectural ruins. Daniel's stomach was hollow with hunger, and his body ached from the cold, but his mind was clear. He knew where he was going. The walk to West Grand Boulevard took almost 2 hours. Daniel moved carefully through neighborhoods in various states of decay, avoiding streets where he knew gangs controlled territory, staying visible enough that police wouldn't think he was breaking into houses but not so visible that anyone would bother him. Detroit in daylight was different from Detroit at night. During the day, the city revealed signs of stubborn survival alongside the ruin. Corner stores still open. Bus stops where people waited to get to jobs that still existed. Churches with fresh paint and marquee signs announcing services and community meals. Gardens planted in empty lots where vegetables grew in soil that had once been someone's front yard. The city was dying, but it wasn't dead. Parts of it were fighting back. The address on the Henderson envelope led to a house that was still standing, one of the few on its block that hadn't been boarded up or burned. It was a small brick bungalow with bars on the windows and a chain-link fence around the yard, but the grass was cut and there were curtains in the windows. Someone lived there. Daniel stood on the sidewalk for several minutes, trying to figure out what he was going to say. Everything he rehearsed in his mind sounded insane. "Hi, I'm a homeless kid and I found a suitcase full of old documents that prove your family was robbed 60 years ago. Here, take this envelope." Nobody was going to believe that. But he'd come this far. He'd made the decision. He couldn't turn back now. Daniel opened the chain-link gate and walked up to the front door. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. He raised his hand and knocked 3 times, the sound echoing across the quiet street. For a long moment nothing happened. Then he heard movement inside, footsteps approaching, and the sound of multiple locks being undone. The door opened a crack, stopped by a security chain, and an elderly woman's face appeared in the gap. She looked at Daniel with immediate suspicion. "I don't want whatever you're selling," she said. "I'm not selling anything," Daniel said quickly. "My name is Daniel. I found something that belongs to your family. I think you might be Gloria Henderson." The woman's expression changed immediately, suspicion shifting to confusion. "How do you know my name?" Daniel held up the envelope, showing her the address and the name written on it in careful script. "This was addressed to your parents, Marcus and Ruth Henderson. I found it with a bunch of other documents hidden in an old factory. I think someone wanted your family to have it." Gloria Henderson stared at the envelope through the gap in the door, and Daniel saw something flicker across her face, some emotion he couldn't quite name. Then she closed the door, and he heard the chain being removed. When the door opened again, she was looking at him with eyes that suddenly seemed much older. "Where did you say you found this?" "In the Packard plant. There was a whole suitcase full of envelopes addressed to different families. This one had your parents' names on it." Gloria took the envelope from his hands carefully, as if it might dissolve if she gripped it too hard. She turned it over, examining the seal, the handwriting, the yellowed paper. Then she opened it. Daniel watched as she pulled out the letter and began to read. He saw her expression change line by line, shock giving way to something deeper, something that looked like grief and rage mixing together. When she finished reading, she looked up at Daniel with tears in her eyes. "This is real," she whispered. "This is what happened to them. To us." She looked back down at the documents, her hands shaking. "My parents told me we used to own our own home. They told me it was stolen from us, that the city took it for some project that never happened. But I was just a little girl. I didn't understand. And after they died I thought maybe I'd remembered it wrong. Maybe they'd been exaggerating, or maybe I'd confused their stories with someone else's." She looked at Daniel with an intensity that made him take a step back. "But this proves it. This proves everything they said was true. They weren't lying. They weren't confused. They were robbed." Daniel nodded, not knowing what to say. Gloria Henderson stared at the documents for another long moment, then looked at Daniel again, really seeing him this time. She took in his dirty clothes, his thin frame, the way he was shivering even though the day was warmer than the night had been. "Child, when was the last time you ate something?" The question caught Daniel off guard. "Yesterday. I had some bread at a church meal." Gloria's expression hardened into something protective and fierce. "You come inside right now. I'm making you breakfast." And then you're going to tell me everything about where you found this and why a child is delivering it instead of some official person. Daniel hesitated. He'd learned not to trust offers of help too easily. But something about the way Gloria Henderson looked at him, like she actually saw him as a person instead of a problem, made him want to trust her. He followed her inside. The house was small and cramped but clean, filled with photographs on every wall and furniture that looked like it had been carefully maintained for decades. The air smelled like coffee and something sweet, maybe cinnamon. Gloria pointed to a chair at a small kitchen table. "Sit. Don't move. I'll be right back." She disappeared into what Daniel assumed was a bedroom, still carrying the envelope. He heard her talking on the phone, her voice urgent but controlled. "Terrence, you need to come to the house right now." "Yes, right now. Something important just happened. Just get here." She came back into the kitchen and started pulling food out of the refrigerator with determined efficiency. "Bacon, bread, butter. I called my son," she said. "He's a lawyer. He needs to see these documents. But first, you're eating." Daniel watched as she cooked, moving around the small kitchen with the practiced rhythm of someone who had prepared thousands of meals in this exact space. Within minutes, she placed a plate in front of him that held more food than he'd seen in days. "Eat," she commanded. "All of it." Daniel didn't need to be told twice. He ate fast, trying not to seem desperate even though he was, trying not to cry even though the simple act of someone making him a meal was almost more than he could handle. Gloria sat across from him, watching him eat with an expression that was both sad and angry. "How long have you been on the streets?" 8 months, Daniel said between bites. "And nobody's helping you. No social workers, no shelters. The shelters are full. And the social workers." He trailed off, not wanting to sound ungrateful but also not wanting to lie. "They try. But there's too many of us and not enough of them." Gloria's mouth pressed into a thin line. "That's not acceptable. That's not even close to acceptable." Before she could say more, there was a knock at the door. She got up to answer it, and Daniel heard a man's voice, younger, asking what was so urgent. Gloria led her son into the kitchen, and Daniel found himself being examined by a man in his 30s wearing a suit that marked him as someone who had made it out of the neighborhood into professional success. "Mom, what's this about?" Instead of answering, Gloria handed him the envelope and the documents. Terrence Henderson read quickly, his expression shifting from confusion to shock to barely controlled fury. "Where did you get these?" he asked, looking at Daniel. Daniel told the story again about the Packard plant, the hidden basement, the suitcase full of envelopes. As he spoke, Terrence kept looking back down at the documents, checking specific details. When Daniel finished, Terrence sat down heavily in a chair. "If these are authentic," he said slowly, "this is evidence of systematic property theft. This isn't just my grandparents. This is a pattern of corruption that affected hundreds of families." He looked at Daniel with sharp intelligence. "You said there were more envelopes. More families documented." "Maybe 50, Daniel said. "All addressed to different people. All with similar letters and documents." Terrence exchanged a look with his mother. "This is bigger than I can handle alone. I need to contact the Michigan Civil Rights Center. And probably the FBI. This is federal-level corruption." Daniel felt a sudden spike of fear. "Am I in trouble? I didn't steal anything. I just found it." Terrence's expression softened. "You're not in trouble, kid. You might have just exposed one of the biggest civil rights cases in Detroit's history. But I need you to show me where you found this, and I need you to help me secure the rest of those documents before someone else finds them." Gloria stood up abruptly. "Before any of that happens, this child needs a safe place to stay and someone looking after him properly." She looked at Daniel with fierce determination. "You're not going back out on those streets. Not after bringing this to us. You understand me? Not one more night out there." Daniel opened his mouth to argue, to say that he didn't need charity, that he could take care of himself. But the words wouldn't come. Because the truth was that he was exhausted and cold, and so tired of being afraid all the time. "Okay," he whispered. What Daniel didn't know was that his decision to deliver that first envelope had set something in motion that would grow far beyond anything he could have imagined. By that evening, Terence Henderson would have contacted 6 different organizations. By the next morning, reporters would be calling. And within a week, Daniel's name would be known across the entire city, not as a homeless kid nobody cared about, but as the boy who had started a reckoning with Detroit's past that nobody could ignore. But in that moment, sitting in Gloria Henderson's kitchen with a full stomach and the first real offer of safety he'd had in months, Daniel just felt tired and grateful and cautiously hopeful that maybe, just maybe, things were going to get better. He had no idea how right he was, or how dangerous it was about to become. The first 24 hours after Daniel delivered the Henderson envelope moved faster than anything he'd experienced in his life. Terence Henderson worked with the kind of focused intensity Daniel had only seen in action movies. By that afternoon, he had contacted the Michigan Civil Rights Center, and 2 attorneys arrived at Gloria's house to interview Daniel and examine the documents. They asked him questions for 3 hours, writing down everything he said, taking photographs of the envelope and its contents, and making him sign statements that they promised would protect him legally. "You found these documents on abandoned property," one of the attorneys explained, a middle-aged black woman named Sharon Cole who had kind eyes but a voice that suggested she didn't tolerate nonsense. "That means you have what's called finder's rights in Michigan law. Nobody can claim you stole them. But more importantly, these documents are evidence of crimes, which means you have a legal obligation to report them to authorities. You're doing exactly the right thing." She looked at him seriously. "But I need you to understand something, Daniel. When we recover the rest of those documents and start going public with this information, there are going to be people who are very upset. People who benefited from the original theft. People whose family wealth was built on stolen property. Some of them might try to discredit you or scare you into staying quiet." Daniel nodded slowly, feeling a cold weight settle in his stomach. "Are they going to hurt me?" Sharon didn't lie to him. "I don't know. Hope not. But we're going to make sure you're protected. That's part of why we need to move fast and secure all the evidence before anyone knows it exists." That evening, Daniel led Terence Henderson and 2 investigators from the Civil Rights Center back to the Packard plant. They brought heavy-duty flashlights, safety equipment, and a determination to document everything properly. The building felt different with other people present. Less haunted. More like what it really was. Just an old factory slowly returning to the earth. Daniel led them to the place where he'd fallen through the floor, and they used ropes and harnesses to descend safely into the basement. The leather suitcase was still where Daniel had left it, covered by the tarp. When they opened it and saw the dozens of envelopes still inside, one of the investigators let out a low whistle. "This is going to change everything," he said quietly. They photographed the scene, documented the location, and carefully removed the suitcase. Every envelope was logged and catalogued. Every name was recorded. By midnight, they had secured all the physical evidence and transported it to a climate-controlled vault at the Civil Rights Center's main office. Daniel spent that night in a guest room at Gloria Henderson's house, sleeping in an actual bed with clean sheets for the first time in 8 months. He woke up several times, confused about where he was, expecting to be back in the cold. But each time, he saw the familiar shadows of bedroom furniture and remembered that he was safe. Least for now. The next morning, Sharon Cole returned with news that made Daniel's stomach drop. "We need to talk about your safety," she said, sitting across from him at Gloria's kitchen table. "We've been reviewing the documents, and we've identified some of the companies and individuals who benefited from the illegal property seizures. Some of them are still very powerful in Detroit. One of them is a city councilman. Another owns a major real estate development company." He paused. "We also found something concerning. There are references in some of the letters to threats and intimidation that James Morrison faced when he tried to document these crimes. We think that's why he hid the suitcase instead of going public with it. He was afraid." Daniel felt his hands start to shake. "So what happens now?" Now we go public, Sharon said firmly. We contact every single family documented in those envelopes. We file lawsuits on behalf of anyone who wants to pursue their claims. And we make sure the story is too big and too public for anyone to try to silence it. She looked at him with fierce protectiveness. But you, Daniel, you don't have to be the face of this if you don't want to be. You can stay anonymous. We can handle everything from here. Daniel thought about it for a long moment. Staying anonymous would be safer. Easier. He could fade back into the background, let the adults handle everything, just be grateful that he had a warm place to sleep and food to eat. But then he thought about all the families whose names were in those envelopes. People who had been robbed and silenced. People who had tried to speak up and been ignored or threatened. If he stayed silent now, wasn't he doing the same thing? I want to help, Daniel said. I want to deliver the envelopes to the families. Like I did with Mrs. Henderson. Sharon Cole studied him carefully. That's very brave. But it's also going to put you in the spotlight. Are you sure? Daniel nodded. Someone has to do it. And I found them. It should be me. What followed was 2 weeks that changed Daniel's life completely. With support from the Civil Rights Center and protection from volunteer community organizers, Daniel began delivering envelopes to families throughout Detroit. Each delivery was documented by reporters who had started following the story. Each family's reaction was photographed and recorded, creating a cascade of human interest stories that spread across local news and then national media. The story had everything reporters loved. A homeless child making a moral choice, hidden historical crimes being exposed, families reunited with stolen inheritances, and powerful people being forced to answer uncomfortable questions. But it was the personal moments that Daniel would remember most. He delivered an envelope to an elderly man named Robert Jackson, who lived alone in a small apartment on the city's west side. The envelope contained proof that Robert's father had owned a small grocery store on Linwood Avenue, property that had been seized illegally in 1965 and later sold to a developer who built a strip mall that still stood on that exact location. Robert had read the documents with tears streaming down his face. My father died believing he was a failure, he said to Daniel. He died thinking he'd lost our family's business because he wasn't smart enough or didn't work hard enough. But it wasn't his fault. It was stolen from him. He looked at Daniel with something like wonder. You gave me back my father's dignity. Thank you. Another delivery went to a woman named Patricia Moore who was Daniel's mother's age, or would have been if his mother had lived. The envelope proved that her grandmother had owned 3 houses on the east side that had been taken through fraudulent tax assessments. The properties were collectively worth hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's market. Patricia had invited Daniel inside and made him hot chocolate while she read through the documents. When she finished, she'd looked at him with fierce determination. I'm going to fight for this. I'm going to get back what they stole. And when I do, I'm going to use some of it to make sure kids like you have better options than the streets. By the 3rd week, the story had reached national news. CNN ran a feature. The New York Times published an investigative piece about Detroit's hidden history of systematic property theft from African American families. And politicians who had been ignoring the issue suddenly started making public statements about the need for historical accountability and reparations. But with visibility came danger. Daniel started receiving threats. Letters delivered to Gloria's house warning him to stop making trouble. Anonymous phone calls telling him that accidents happened to kids who didn't know when to shut up. Suspicious cars parked on the street outside watching. The Civil Rights Center responded by arranging for security. Volunteers from community organizations formed a rotation to make sure someone was always watching the house. Off-duty police officers who believed in what Daniel was doing volunteered their time for protection details. But the threats escalated. One night, someone threw a brick through Gloria Henderson's front window. The brick had a note attached. Stop digging up the past or you'll all end up buried in it. Gloria had stared at the broken glass with a rage Daniel had never seen in her before. They think they can scare me, she said to the police officer who responded to the call. They think I'm going to let some coward with a brick stop me from protecting this child and seeking justice for my parents. She turned to Daniel. You're staying here. You understand me. You're staying right here where I can see you, and we're not backing down. Not 1 inch. But the danger was real, and it was escalating. Sharon Cole received information from a source within the police department that there were discussions happening, quiet conversations about how to manage the situation, how to contain the damage to certain reputations and business interests. We need to accelerate the timeline, she told Daniel and Gloria during an emergency meeting. We need to file all the lawsuits simultaneously and hold a major press conference that makes this story too big to bury. Once everything is public and official, it becomes much harder for anyone to try to silence individual people. The plan was set for the following Monday. Lawyers representing 32 different families would file simultaneous lawsuits seeking property restoration and financial compensation. Daniel would appear at a press conference to explain how he'd found the documents and why he'd chosen to deliver them to the rightful families. But on Sunday night, something happened that threatened to derail everything. Daniel woke up to the smell of smoke. He sat up in bed, disoriented, his mind still half caught in a dream. But the smell was real and getting stronger. He heard Gloria shouting from somewhere in the house, heard Terence's voice yelling something about calling 911. Daniel ran into the hallway and saw smoke pouring in through the front windows. Through the glass, he could see flames climbing up the front porch, feeding on something that had been piled against the door. Someone had set Gloria Henderson's house on fire. With Daniel inside, the next minutes were chaos. Terence broke through a back window and helped Gloria and Daniel climb out into the backyard. Neighbors came running with garden hoses. Fire trucks arrived within minutes, sirens wailing through the night. The fire was contained before it could spread beyond the front porch, but the message was clear. Someone wanted Daniel dead, and they were willing to burn down a house to make it happen. As Daniel sat on the curb wrapped in a blanket given to him by a paramedic, watching firefighters spray down the smoking remains of Gloria's porch, he felt something shift inside him. Fear was still there, but it was overwhelmed by a cold, clear anger. Whoever was doing this thought they could scare him into silence. They thought a homeless kid with no power and no protection would just disappear if they made things dangerous enough. They were wrong. Sharon Cole arrived 30 minutes after the fire started, having been called by Terence. She took one look at the scene and made several phone calls, her voice sharp and commanding. Then she crouched down in front of Daniel. Tomorrow's press conference just became the most important event of your life, she said. Because now you're not just exposing historical crimes. You're exposing current crimes. Someone just tried to kill you to keep these secrets hidden. That's attempted murder. That's witness intimidation. That's federal. She looked at him with absolute seriousness. I need to know right now if you're still willing to go through with this. Because once you stand in front of those cameras tomorrow and tell everyone what happened here tonight, there's no taking it back. You'll be committed. And I can't guarantee your safety, even with all the protection we can arrange. Daniel thought about his parents, who had died in a fire. He thought about James Morrison, who had documented these crimes and then hidden the evidence because he was too afraid to go public. He thought about all the families whose lives had been stolen and who had never gotten justice. He looked at Sharon Cole and spoke with a voice that didn't shake. I'm going to the press conference, and I'm telling everyone everything. Sharon nodded slowly, and something like respect crossed her face. Okay then. Let's make sure your story changes everything. The press conference was held at noon on Monday in the main hall of the Michigan Civil Rights Center. The room was packed with reporters from local, national, and international media outlets. Cameras lined the back wall. Journalists crowded every seat and stood along the sides. Daniel sat at a long table between Sharon Cole and Terence Henderson. Behind them stood representatives from 32 families whose property had been documented in the stolen envelopes. Gloria Henderson was in the front row, her arm in a sling from a minor injury sustained during the fire. Her expression fierce and proud. Sharon spoke first, outlining the historical context of the property seizures and the legal cases being filed. Then Terence explained the documentation that had been found and authenticated. And then it was Daniel's turn. He stepped up to the microphone, aware that everything he said was being recorded and broadcast, aware that his words would be permanent. "My name is Daniel," he began, his voice quiet but steady. "I'm 11 years old, and I've been homeless for 8 months. 3 weeks ago, I was looking for shelter during a cold night, and I found a suitcase hidden in an abandoned factory. Inside were documents proving that dozens of families in Detroit had their property stolen through illegal evictions and corrupt government officials." He paused, gathering his courage. "I could have sold those documents or used them to try to get money for myself. But I decided to deliver them to the families they belonged to because it was the right thing to do. Because those families deserved to know the truth about what happened to them." His voice grew stronger. "Last night, someone tried to burn down the house where I was staying. They tried to kill me because they don't want these stories to come out. They want to keep these secrets hidden because the truth threatens their power and their money." He looked directly into the cameras. "But I'm still here. And I'm not going to stop until every family in those envelopes gets their documents and has a chance to fight for justice. Because if I stay silent now, then all the people who were robbed stay silent forever. And that's not acceptable." The room erupted in questions, reporters shouting to be heard. But Sharon held up a hand for silence and turned the microphone over to some of the family members who were there to share their own stories. One by one, they spoke about what had been stolen from them, about properties lost, about inheritances never received, about family histories that had been erased and were now being reclaimed. By the time the press conference ended, the story had momentum that nobody could stop. Federal investigations were announced within hours. The city council scheduled emergency hearings. And 2 of the individuals implicated in the original property seizures resigned from their current positions before charges could be filed. But more importantly, Daniel's act of moral courage had inspired something deeper. Donations started pouring in to create a legal defense fund for all the families seeking to reclaim their property. Community organizations mobilized to search for more hidden evidence of historical crimes. And people across Detroit started talking openly about injustices that had been ignored for decades. 3 months later, Daniel stood in a courtroom as Gloria Henderson's formal adoption petition was approved. She had spent those months fighting through red tape and bureaucracy to make it official, to give Daniel a legal family and a permanent home. "You saved my family by bringing us those documents," Gloria had told him when she first proposed the adoption. "Now let me save you by giving you a home." The judge who approved the adoption looked at Daniel with genuine warmth. "Young man, what you did took extraordinary courage and moral clarity. The city is better because of you. And I have no doubt that your future is going to be remarkable." By the time Daniel turned 12, his life had transformed completely. He lived in a house that had been repaired and reinforced, made safer than ever. He attended a good school where teachers knew his story and supported his education. He worked with the Civil Rights Center on educational programs about property rights and historical justice. And he watched as, one by one, the families from the envelopes won their court cases or reached settlements that restored at least some of what had been stolen from them. Robert Jackson used his settlement to start a scholarship fund for children who had aged out of foster care. Patricia Moore opened a community center that provided services for homeless youth. Others bought houses, started businesses, or simply had the financial security they'd been denied for generations. But the impact went beyond individual families. The publicity around Daniel's discovery forced Michigan to establish new oversight mechanisms for property seizures. Laws were changed to make it harder to evict families through bureaucratic manipulation. And a statewide program was created to search for similar cases of historical property theft. On the anniversary of the night he'd found the suitcase, Daniel returned to the Packard plant with Gloria, Terence, and Sharon. The city had designated the building as a historical landmark, and there were plans to convert part of it into a museum about Detroit's complicated history of racial injustice and urban development. They stood in the basement where Daniel had fallen through the floor, where his life had changed direction so completely. "Do you ever regret it?" Sharon asked him. "Making the choice you made instead of using those documents for yourself?" Daniel thought about it carefully before answering. "I was afraid and cold and hungry that night," he said. "And I really did think about keeping everything for myself. But I knew that if I did that, I'd just be one more person stealing from people who had already been robbed. I'd be part of the problem instead of part of the solution." He looked around the basement, remembering how desperate he'd felt that night. "I was homeless because the system failed me. Those families lost their property because the system failed them. And I figured maybe the way to fix a broken system isn't to play by its broken rules. Maybe the way to fix it is to do something so completely different that people have to pay attention." Gloria put her arm around his shoulders. "You didn't just pay attention," she said. "You changed the conversation entirely. You showed this city that justice is still possible, even for old crimes, even when powerful people want to keep them hidden." She smiled at him. "And you showed a lot of people that heroes don't always look like what we expect. Sometimes they're just kids doing the right thing because it's right, not because it's easy or safe or benefits them directly." As they left the building and walked back toward their car, Daniel looked out over Detroit's skyline. The city was still struggling, still dealing with poverty and population decline and all the accumulated weight of decades of bad decisions. But it was also rebuilding, fighting back, refusing to disappear, just like Daniel had. He'd found something nobody expected in the darkness of an abandoned building. And what he'd done with it had shocked the entire city, not because it was complex or clever, but because it was simply powerfully good. He'd chosen justice over survival. He'd chosen other people's rights over his own comfort. And in doing so, he'd reminded everyone that moral clarity isn't about age or experience or power. It's about recognizing what's right and having the courage to act on it, even when you're cold and afraid and alone. Daniel would face many more challenges in his life. The trauma of homelessness would take years to fully process. The dangers he'd faced wouldn't completely disappear. And the work of seeking historical justice was far from finished. But he would face all of it with something he hadn't had when he'd fallen through that floor in the Packard plant. A family who loved him, a community that supported him, and the absolute certainty that one person making one right choice could change everything. The homeless boy had found something nobody expected. And what he did with it didn't just shock the city. It reminded everyone that hope and justice are still possible, as long as someone is brave enough to fight for them.